Welcome to our podcast on the U.S. zero tolerance policy for Listeria monocytogenes. Today, we're diving into the roots of the U.S. zero tolerance policy for Listeria in ready-to-eat foods. Michael, this policy didn't just appear out of thin air, did it?
Not at all, Margaret. The origins are pretty dramatic. The policy traces back to two major outbreaks in the 1980s. First, there was the 1981 outbreak in Canada linked to coleslaw, of all things. That one resulted in 41 illnesses and 18 deaths. It was a wake-up call for public health officials everywhere.
And then, of course, the 1985 California cheese outbreak. That was a real turning point for the U.S. I came across it in my research. Queso fresco-style cheese, right? The numbers were devastating. 142 cases, 48 deaths, many of which were fetal or neonatal. It shocked the food safety world and set the stage for the zero-tolerance approach.
Absolutely. After that, the FDA and USDA decided that any detectable Listeria monocytogenes, or LM, in ready-to-eat foods would be considered an adulterant. If you found even a single cell in a 25-gram sample, the whole batch was deemed illegal. This rule was cemented in the 1990s, especially after the 1995 US vs. Union cheese case, which made it clear any detectable LM was a violation, period.
It's interesting because, at the time, the science was so limited. The policy was seen as the most protective measure available, especially after such tragic outbreaks. But it also had ripple effects beyond the US. I found a case in my research where the 1985 California outbreak sparked debates in Europe and Australia about whether their own standards were strict enough. It became a global reference point for food safety policy.
Yeah, it was a global domino effect. But the zero-tolerance stance was a blunt instrument. It was about acting decisively in the face of uncertainty, but it didn't leave much room for nuance or for the science to evolve. And that's where things get really interesting, right? Since the 1980s, our understanding of Listeria has changed dramatically. We now have tools like quantitative microbial risk assessment, or QMRA, that let us estimate risk based on how much LM is present, not just whether it's there.
Exactly. The science now shows that the risk of listeriosis isn't just about the presence or absence of Listeria. It's about the dose, the type of food, and even the specific strain. For example, the 2004 FAO risk assessment found that foods with very low levels of LM, up to 100 colony-forming units per gram, pose negligible risk to the general population, especially if the food doesn't support Listeria growth.
Right, and not all strains are equally dangerous. Some lack the genes needed to cause disease, while others, these hyper-virulent clones, are responsible for most human illnesses. But the US policy doesn't distinguish between them. It's zero tolerance across the board. And that rigidity has real-world consequences. Margaret, you must have seen this firsthand. The economic burden on food producers, especially small businesses, can be enormous. Recalls for products that scientifically pose no risk, but the rules say they have to go.
Oh, absolutely. I remember advising a small bakery once. They had a low-level positive on a product that had never been linked to illness. The recall costs nearly put them out of business, and it creates this weird incentive where companies might avoid aggressive testing because they're afraid of what they'll find. It's a safety paradox. A policy meant to protect us can actually discourage the testing that would make food safer in the long run.
And then there's the inconsistency within the US itself. The FDA sticks to zero tolerance for foods like cheese and produce, but the USDA uses a more flexible, risk-based approach for things like deli meats. It's confusing for companies and doesn't support a unified, science-based strategy.
Yeah, it's a patchwork. The USDA encourages things like post-lethality treatments, steps taken after cooking to kill any LM that might be present. But under FDA rules, even a tiny amount found in a hard cheese can trigger a recall. It's not a system that's keeping up with the science, that's for sure.
So, if we look beyond the US, the global trend is clear. Countries like Canada, the EU, Japan, and Brazil have moved to risk-based standards that align with Codex Alimentarius guidelines, and the results are impressive. Canada, for example, saw industry savings of around $20 million a year after adopting a tiered, risk-based system, and they maintained low rates of listeriosis.
Yeah, and the EU has seen a 30% drop in listeriosis rates since 2010 after adopting similar standards. They use advanced tools like whole genome sequencing to track outbreaks, which helps target interventions more effectively. Japan and Brazil have also reported positive outcomes after making the switch. It's a real global consensus at this point.
But the US remains committed to zero tolerance. Even though our own agencies considered risk-based reforms in the early 2000s, tragic outbreaks like the 2011 cantaloupe and 2015 ice cream incidents led to a policy U-turn. The fear of even rare, low-dose cases seems to have kept the door closed on reform.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? On one hand, you want to protect the most vulnerable, but on the other, you don't want to ignore the science or create unnecessary burdens. Other countries have shown you can modernize food safety policy without compromising public health. I think the US could benefit from looking at those examples and maybe, just maybe, rethinking how we approach listeria in the 21st century.
Absolutely. It's not about weakening standards. It's about making them smarter and more effective. As science continues to advance, it's crucial for policy to keep pace. Well, that's all we have time for today. Margaret, always a pleasure discussing these issues with you.
Likewise, Michael. Thanks for the great conversation, and thanks to everyone listening. There's a lot more to unpack in future episodes, so stay tuned. Goodbye, everyone.
Take care until next time. Bye all.